Hey everybody, I'm Hugh Brownstone for Three Blind Men and an Elephant, and today we're going to cover a bunch of cameras, but really in service of just two in particular. The soon-to-be-unveiled Nikon mirrorless full-frame, and the camera I think it has to beat the Sony a7 III. Not the a7R III, not the A9, not the Leica SL, not its own D850. Nikon's full-frame mirrorless camera has to beat what Sony calls, and this was a marketing masterstroke, its basic full-frame mirrorless camera. Their least expensive $2,000 mirrorless full-frame camera. That's because 6 months after the a7 III launch event and additional experience with it, I'm filming with an a7 III right now using their 55mm f1.8 at f2, I've come to understand more fully precisely what it is that we're looking at in the a7 III. And that simply is the state of the art as of early August 2018. But this is an important qualifier, so hold that thought. Yes, there are cameras with higher resolution sensors. There are cameras with bigger, higher resolution sensors. There are cameras that can record at higher bit rates in video without limit or capture 16-bit raw stills. Cameras with better EVFs, vastly superior ergonomics, more personality. But none of them can touch the a7 as a complete package at the price. They'll compete with or even beat the a7 III along 1, 2, maybe 3 dimensions, but never the full package. And never across these 3 particular dimensions simultaneously. Stills image quality, autofocus performance, and 4K video. The dirty little secret is that this is true irrespective of price. Which most certainly does not make it the best camera for everyone. I'm not saying that at all. But let's do a quick recap of how the a7 III stacks up against a number of cameras we've used and tested over the past 12 months to make the case. And then let's talk about what it means for Nikon and, by extension, Canon. Good? All right, here we go. If you're a video-first hybrid shooter and want 10-bit 422 unlimited internal recording 4K, up to 60 frames per second with an all-intra codec, and while we're at it, how about 180 frames per second in full HD? Better IBIS and superior ergonomics, including menu system, manual controls, touch interface, rear panel, and EVF, well, you already know the Panasonic GH5 is the ticket, and it costs $200 less than the Sony. Never mind thousands and thousands less than any dedicated video camera that can match those specs. It's, in fact, why we bought one. But even with the recent firmware update, the GH5's video autofocus is not as good as the Sony's. The GH5's IAF and tracking AF for stills are not as good as the Sony's. And it cannot match the a7 III's low-light performance at the margin, nor its dynamic range. But hold that thought too. If you're a stills first, joy of the process kind of shooter, and want personality, direct control over the exposure triangle of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, you know that the Fuji X Pro 2 or Fuji X-T2 and the brilliant line of small, tasty crop sensor primes are the ticket, especially now that the X-T2 is half the price of the a7 III. But there's no IBIS, and it's very hard to go without once you've used it. The autofocus is not as good, the low-light performance is not as good, and just as with the GH5 or any crop sensor camera, you can't go quite as shallow when you're looking for ultimate bokeh and subject isolation, this latter point being the more important of the two for our work. At least, if you want to use autofocus lenses. What if you're a high-end product, portrait, or fashion photographer and want 16-bit RAW? A great, simple software interface married to bold industrial design, and brilliant lenses all wrapped into a larger format because you and your clients appreciate the nuanced differences in color and perspective for a given field of view. Well, the Hasselblad X1D is an answer, but forget about video, autofocus, or IBIS. The first is really a placeholder. The second is not as capable as the Sony, and the last, wholly absent. It's also fair to say that it's still early days for the X1D system with a very limited selection of native mount AF lenses, some continuing teething problems, and it's more than 3 times the price. You could Get the Fuji GFX50S with its superior ergonomics, wonderful film emulations, optional and very appealing to me, tilting EVF adapter, and more mature, more complete lens line. I was very surprised by how much I like the system, but you still wouldn't have IBIS. The autofocus isn't superb. Video is very limited, and you'd only have 14-bit color depth, same as the A7 III. Now, if you want incredible heritage and deeply considered, what I actually think is the best in the industry industrial design, the best build quality in the industry to boot, arguably the best colors straight out of the camera, but don't need medium format or 16-bit stills, maybe don't even need 4K video at all, well, any of today's true Leicas, the full frame M, SL, and Q, or the APS-C, TL2, or CL, will give you that. And the SL will give you external 10-bit 422 4K recording, and an EVF that blows the Sonys out of the water. I mean, blows them all out of the water, actually. But you can pay up to 3 or 4 times the price of the A7 III for a Leica. Forget about their medium format S or S2. The autofocus won't be as good, except in the case of the M, where it doesn't matter because it's manual focus only, and none of them will perform as well at the highest ISOs. Finally, if you want an even higher burst rate, with image quality and video every bit as good as the A7 III, and autofocus maybe even better. Or you can live with the burst rate but want higher resolution. Of course, no worries, get the Sony A7R III or A9, but get comfortable with the idea of spending 50% or 125% more. And the A7 III's autofocus may not be quite as good as the basic 3s. Yeah, I know I didn't mention Olympus. I've tried for 2 years to connect with these guys, but hey, it's fine. The simple truth is that if you define image quality as a function of low light performance, dynamic range, color fidelity, lens sharpness, color, and bite, percentage of shots in focus, and define versatility as being able to capture those images across the widest set of use cases, from live events, weddings, sports, to street, product, wildlife, landscape, portrait, fashion, travel, and capture beautiful 4K video that only professional DPs, and only some at that, would find wanting. The Sony A7 III is, and toto at a practical level, for all but the tiniest fraction of us, technically superior to just about everything else out there, irrespective of price. And on top of all of that, Sony now has a brilliant lens line, from outstanding image quality budget primes. We're talking 250 to 600 a pop for the 28-2, 51.8, and 85 1.8, though that 50 makes old-style clunking sounds whenever it changes focus, reminding me of nothing so much as my old Canon Plastic Fantastic 50, so not good for video. To the no-compromise G Masters all the way up to the 400 2.8 with more long coming, and then the lenses in between, like the outstanding 12 to 24 and 24 to 105 f4s. Where there are holes, they're filled by a burgeoning third-party market with glass, like Sigma's 24 1.4, which is my favorite wide-angle focal length and aperture, 135 1.8, my favorite portrait spec, Zeiss's 25mm f2 Batis, or with adapters, even glass like Canon's tilt and shift lenses. This is simply a robust product line and ecosystem. And, oh, by the way, apropos nothing I've said to this point, actually, their tethering app is very good, and all of these lenses are new. What has this state-of-the-art done for us? Well, for 3 blind men and an elephant, it has given us a higher hit rate with better color and lower noise at the margin for fast-moving portrait and street photography work than our A6300 and GH5. It has allowed us to do our video work outdoors with a single 10-stop neutral density filter because we're very comfortable jacking up ISO when we need to, unworried by the potential for noise, and relieved of that darned star pattern worry that shows up in variable NDs or even stacked single density NDs. It allows me to shoot videos like this with the shallower depth of field I need given the minimal distance behind me. 3 reasons for this. 1, depth of field from the 1.8 on the full frame sensor is twice as shallow as it is on our GH5 for a given field of view. Yes, don't even go there. I know it's about equivalent focal lengths to achieve the field of view and the resultant distance to the subject differential and the perspective differential, blah, 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 blah. 2, the autofocus is so good that I don't have to worry much about the limits of manual pre-focusing and staying within a narrow range front to back. And 3, these are darned crispy lenses, though, to be fair, they are not better than the primes we have for the Micro Four Thirds camera we use, which are marvelous. We'll probably have to tell you about that in another video. It allows us to print from that 24 megapixel sensor the 4-foot by 8-foot banner directly behind me, and it looks good straight out of camera, JPEG, no post other than perspective correction and crop. I'll step out of the way and I'll show it to you a bit later so you can judge for yourself. But in the meantime, wrap your head around that one. Although, really, is that a surprise to any of you? Because perceived sharpness has always been a function of, beyond the quality of the image itself, image size and viewing distance. Which is why Apple, for example, can put up enormous billboards in major cities with images from its Shot on iPhone campaign that look amazing. Anyway, finally, it allows us to shoot lighter and quicker in the field, first because the small 28 f2.0 and 55 1.8, which we typically use, balance better, shoot faster, and weigh less than, say, the excellent Sony FE24-105 f4, which we also bought, or an adapted pair of the Sigma 1.8 zooms, which are brilliant but big and very heavy. And second, when the kit is this light and the IBIS this good, we can leave the tripod and the monopod at home. Claudia shot this segment handheld, aided only by a SmallRig half cage with handle, with a Luxley light and RØDElink receiver mounted to boot. Going forward, the A7 III is the best choice for us for an upcoming commercial shoot we've got at a local boutique fitness studio. That's because we'll minimize disruption to classes by working small with available light at the margin where the differences in high ISO performance will be significant. But state of the art is always at a moment in time, and it doesn't mean flawless. You guys know that. So, putting together all of what I've just said, this is why the A7 III is the camera Nikon has to beat. If it doesn't advance the state of the art, they lose. And Sony will be maybe only one product cycle away for doing it themselves. Doing it to themselves. Something both Nikon and Canon have been loath to do for years. Though, it should be mentioned, Canon in particular used to be much more aggressive. 31 years ago, it introduced the EF mount we know today, obsoleting the previous FD mount introduced in 1971, which in turn obsoleted the FL mount introduced in 1964, which obsoleted the R mount introduced in 1959 with the original Canon flex. Of course, Canon was the attacker then, as Sony is now. If you want to get into what that means, the strategy end of it, I can recommend an oldie but goodie, a book by Dick Foster, Richard N. Foster, entitled Innovation, The Attacker's Advantage. But in any case, let's move on. For your intellectual pleasure, here are the specific ways in which the current state of the art leaves us wanting more, and thus providing Nikon or Canon opportunities to move the goalposts. Number 1, focus. While the A7 III's autofocus is excellent, it remains fallible, especially when you're trying to get the camera to be psychic and pick out the one object in a crowded scene that you want sharp, and darn it, the camera should know it too. And it remains a frustratingly complicated to tune system. What we've learned is that you really do need to dive into the menus, pick one of the focus options, say face recognition or central field for this kind of video, or flexible spot, especially for the aforementioned psychic scenario, rather than, as has often been the advice even from Sony, just sticking with wide. As I said, even then, there's tuning to be done. Worse, there will be times when it makes sense to use wide, yet a moment may arise during the shoot when you need to manually override it using DMF. That's what it's there for. But this is a problem for us as hybrid shooters because it turns out DMF is not available in manual movie mode, which makes no sense and drives us nuts when we're shooting out in the field. Then again, the combination of a half-inch 2.4 million dot EVF, as opposed to the 3.7 million half-inch dot EVFs of the A7R3, A9, GH5, G9, and XH1, never mind the 4.4 million dot 0.6 of an inch EVF of the Leica SL, and middling peaking functionality, along with the usual joylessness of virtually all fly-by-wire lenses, make manual focusing more difficult than we'd like anyway. Which in turn makes the fact that IAF is another AF mode not available when in manual movie mode all the more frustrating. And not for nothing, but if and when you want to rely on autofocus in very low light with the A7 III, don't. Nikon has a huge opportunity to improve autofocus algorithms with a corresponding bump in processor power. It has the opportunity to put in a bigger, higher resolution EVF with more precise peaking and higher magnification to improve manual focus. It has an opportunity to reduce the exception cases where mouth-wateringly appealing focus modes are unavailable. It has an opportunity to take a page out of the Fuji 16mm f1.4 and Leica Q 28mm f1.7 manuals when it comes to manually focusing autofocus lenses. All of these would advance the state of the art. Just as another aside, the most brilliant, satisfying manual autofocus system I've yet used is on the Leica Q. But, of course, it has its limitations too, which we'll leave for another video. So, yeah, right. Number 2, low light performance. The A7 III is on par for low light performance with the best full frame sensors out there and astoundingly close to the best medium format sensors as well. But, as I just said, you can't rely on the A7 III to give you magical image quality at very high ISOs. What we've learned is that when you leave the realm of theoretical high ISO performance and actually use the A7 III away from, say, nightlife in the city, where, by the way, we've never needed to shoot above 12,800, as in, say, trying to shoot at dusk out here in the bucolic, increasingly rainforest-like Philadelphia suburbs, and is in theory and artistically a very, very cool use of high ISO performance, 102,400 in this example. Neither the image quality nor the autofocus are anything to write home about. In fact, you could argue it's useless, and for commercial purposes, I'd agree. But that's why real DPs, or even guys like me, except sometimes when we're testing gear, light. If Nikon uses a standard-sized 24-megapixel full-frame sensor in their full-frame mirrorless like the A7 III, I don't see how it will be able to leapfrog the A7 III to deliver superior low-light performance, unless, again, it pumps up the algorithms and processor. But the rub here, as I said moments ago, is that current digital medium format sensors, like the 50-megapixel one in the X1D and Fuji GFX50S, are not dramatically better in low light than the A7 III, in large part because they have just about twice the pixels, with a resulting pixel pitch actually smaller than the A7 III's, 5.3 microns versus the A7 III's 5.9. Though it is intriguing to contemplate when Sony or Tower Jazz or somebody else will deliver a backside illuminated 100 or 150 megapixel medium format sensor, which in turn could almost immediately put the squeeze on Nikon's full frame mirrorless. I mean, I keep wondering about the actual throat diameter of this new Z mount and how big a sensor can actually be crammed in there. And when Hasselblad and Fujifilm will release their next versions of the X1D and GFX50S, or some lower priced Fuji, I don't remember what the model name is supposed to be. The bottom line is advancing the state of the art in low light performance, which the teaser in fact stresses, will be critical. Number 3, in-body image stabilization. While the Sony's IBIS is actually surprisingly good when the camera isn't really moving, it doesn't hold a candle to the Panasonic GH5 or even better G9 when walking, even when it's Claudia, who is an absolutely fantastic gimbal op. With that huge Z mount, like I said, I'm still unclear what huge actually means in this case, Nikon ought to, needs to, advance to the state of the art in full frame in-body image stabilization. Full stop. Number 4, internal video recording. Now, for most of us, the absence of internal 10-bit 422 4K recording at 24 frames per second, let alone 60, is less important than unlimited recording time. Unfortunately, the A7 III offers none of this, as I've mentioned. So Nikon has the opportunity to advance the state of the art by providing this functionality in their full-frame mirrorless, which would suddenly put significant pressure not only on Sony's entire A7 A9 series, their FS series, but on Leica's SL. In fact, you know that Panasonic's GH5 already does this, so why not give it a clean sheet design, but then it would put pressure on that one. Number 5, which many, including me, actually regard as Nikon's first priority, because if they don't get this right, really the rest is commentary. I'm talking about ergonomics. And in fact, do I even need to explain this? Sony's singular weak spot has been and remains, even with improvements, its ergonomics. Nikon ought to be able to knock this out of the park, but if it just lifts its current manual of arms to its mirrorless offering, which I actually fear it will, making it an easy migration path for current Nikon users, this leaves an incredible amount of opportunity on the table. Panasonic, Fuji, Hasselblad, and Leica most of all have been much more thoughtful in their latest designs. And again, Nikon runs the risk of getting caught in the crossfire between larger and smaller sensors relatively quickly. Remember that just prior to introducing its revolutionary new EOS series camera in 1987, Canon introduced an entirely new design vocabulary with its T90, the last manual focus film camera, attributed primarily to Luigi Colani and referred to as Bioform. This style has served as the basis for every Canon DSLR since and marked the beginning of Canon's multi-decade dominance of the market. Number 6, almost everything else. There are smaller things which may matter more or less to you than they do to us. This is advancing the state of the art at a specific price point. In other words, Nikon has the opportunity to out-A7 III the A7 III. While the A7 III's new Z battery lasts much longer than the PEZ-sized battery of its predecessor, it takes almost 5 hours to charge. This isn't a big deal if you have 2 batteries or if you plug into the wall, but if you only have one, lose or forget to bring a second, or forget the charging cable, you're hosed. Nikon has the opportunity to invest in fast charging, even wireless charging, or a higher capacity, longer lasting battery, or all 3, but I'm not holding my breath. The A7 III has no built-in intervalometer, nor a T-shutter with long exposure timer built in. This is a bigger deal to us than it was, as we've begun to shoot more of this kind of imagery. This omission feels like one of the few instances where Sony is protecting its pricier offering, the A7R III, but that means that Nikon has the opportunity to include it at what I suspect is exceptionally minor incremental cost. I mean, I can't imagine it's more than a firmware upgrade should Sony ever decide to do it. In the meantime, Nikon should do it. The A7 III also omits pixel shifting, and this too is becoming a bigger deal for us. Again, you have to buy up into an A7R III if you want this functionality in the Sony lineup, but Panasonic's 20 megapixel micro four thirds $1,700 G9 has it, and it's incredible. Yet another opportunity for Nikon, and they should do it. The A7 III has no pre-programmed transition focus like that found on the GH5, though the A7 III's touch focus and touch focus pull are now really nice. But the disadvantage of relying on touch focus is that you must have a really stable tripod, translation bigger and heavier, if you're going to use it, and recognize that many of today's most popular tripods are actually not good enough for this, nor for pixel shift at that. Nikon would be well advised to offer both really well done. Sony's remote app remains underwhelming, and Nikon should really, just once and for all, crush this. I mean, I don't know of a single camera manufacturer that has made the communication between its cameras and smartphones truly dead simple or reliable. The first manufacturer who offers a highly performant, no limitations app that allows you full control over the camera at the limits of the smartphone's resolution and automatic communication while you're at it would advance the state of the art. Number 7, the one other thing, the single biggest advancement of the state of the art, actually. Internal neutral density, something equivalent or some combination thereof filters. The A7 III has a base ISO of 100 in movie mode. This means, following the rule of Sunny 16, that it requires, call it 8 stops of light reduction to shoot at 1/50th of a second wide open at f1.4 in bright sunlight. This in turn also means, given the current state of the art in hybrids, either multiple single density neutral density filters that you screw in, or a variable neutral density filter that you screw in, which in any case is not nearly as useful or as easy as the internal variable electronic neutral density filters of Sony's FS5, FS5 II, and FS7 II. It would be a revelation if Sony could put that technology into its A7 series, A9 series, and I can't imagine they're not working on it as I speak. But they may be constrained by the size of the E-mount, and they are certainly constrained commercially, because were they to offer it, especially in a next generation A7S, the version 3 that we're all waiting for, it's likely that some measure of FS5, FS5 II, and perhaps even FS7 and FS7 II sales would suffer. Nikon, on the other hand, is not constrained this way. It, as we've said now several times, may have the lens mount, the flange distance, and certainly has a clean sheet of paper with the new lens line. Even more tantalizingly and immediately, the F-mount adapter to build this kind of variable ND into the launch product, which they absolutely should do, else they run the risk of the big reveal later this month being overshadowed weeks later at Photokina, or shortly thereafter at Photo Plus New York, or early into 2019, which, of course, leads one to wonder about how Canon sees the opportunity for their first serious, mirrorless, full frame, and what they'll do, rather than what they say they'll do. And wonder if Nikon and Canon really do go for it, what this means for the crop sensor world, and Leica's full frame SL, because if, this is a huge, huge if, Nikon pulls off what we've been talking about here, at anywhere close to that $2,000 mark, even $3,000, and doesn't go wild pricing its new lenses or the F-mount adapter, they'll put a world of hurt on the entire market. That is what advancing state-of-the-art does. That is what mirrorless has already done to other segments of the market, which is actually fascinating commercially, because Nikon doesn't make sensors. Sony does. Nikon's got nothing to lose to gut the market. Sony does. This is going to be a really interesting next couple of months. If you like what you've seen here today, please give a thumbs up, subscribe, join the conversation below. You guys continue to be just incredible, knowledgeable, inspiring, funny. I mean, you're a joy, truly. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Grab one or both of our new Hold That Thought t-shirts you wanted us to put up at our new 3BMEPthreadless.com store. Support our work by using our affiliate links down below in the show notes, dropping us coffee money via our PayPal link down below in the show notes, or even better than that, we invite you to become a patron of our work over at Patreon. Link down below. We've created our Patreon page because we are stoked to bring you not only gear reviews, but with our What Were You Thinking and Good World Gone Bad series, historical, educational, artistic morsels, and longer form conversations, not interviews, with world-class photographers, curators, gallery owners, keepers of the legacy, folks like Elliot Irwitt, Anya Sear, Mark Lubell, Ethylene Staley, and friends like Brian Smith, Paul Giroux, Nino Rakicevic, and more. We'd really like you to join us to deliver this kind of content regularly. Your support on Patreon will really help us ramp it up. In which case, as always, we thank you for it. That's it. For Three Blind Men and an Elephant, I'm Hugh Brownstone. See you next time.